So, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this week's 120 Dublin Stories with Santa Rita and the Little Museum. This week, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Jason McElligott, the director of Marsh's Library. Jason, thank you so much for being here.
No, thank you, Sarah, for the invitation to chat. It's great to be able to talk to somebody outside my bubble.
You resemble that remark at this moment in time, and I was only thinking about it before we began the conversation this evening, that it's actually in a nice way an opportunity to travel around the city and to meet some of my neighbouring institutions while we're all currently closed. So I guess thank you for letting me be a tourist in my own city this evening. Now, Jason, I'm going to just jump in and ask you a question just to start off. I'd love you just to bring us back to the beginning and to tell us a little bit about the founding of Marsh's Library.
Well, Sarah, it was open to the public in 1707, so it's over 300 years old, and it was established by Narcissus Marsh, who was an Englishman who came to Dublin in 1679 as Provost of Trinity College, and I think he was a little bit surprised at the lack of provision for libraries and public reading in Dublin. So he tried to have the rules changed in Trinity Library to allow people who weren't accompanied by fellows or the lead, and he failed to do that. So essentially what he, at his earliest opportunity, he was determined to set up a public library in Dublin, and that was his plan. Obviously, he was distracted by various things, and it was only by the start of the 18th century that he was in a position to move ahead with that. And he had a little sliver of land. He was given a little sliver of land between what's now the old Kevin Street Garda station, which was the Archbishop's Palace at the time, the deanery of St. Patrick's Cathedral and St. Patrick's Cathedral itself. And with his own money then, he had a library built. An idea that he really couldn't understand why there wasn't a library, and he was determined to get it built.
Okay, strangely, I'd never known the Trinity connection myself. But do you still have much of a relationship with the university?
We do. When we were set up, Archbishop Marsh was a canny old fox, essentially, and he had sort of set up a whole series of trustees of the library, ex officio trustees. So one of the ex officio trustees, and we might talk about it later, we still have the same Act of Parliament which established the library in perpetuity. Very unusual thing to do, but one of our ex officio trustees is still the provost of Trinity College. So I have mentioned that to somebody before, and they said, but surely he can't be still alive. And I said, yeah, no, it's not the same provost. It's the ex officio provost. So, whoever is provost who wins the election to be provost, then I have to contact him or her and say, congratulations, you've also won the Booby Prize. You're sitting on my board as well.
Okay, you were insinuating a ghost story there otherwise, which, speaking of kind of coming into that, I understand there is a number of ghost stories that surround the library.
Yeah, there's a whole series of ghost stories just because the library has been there for so long. And some of them, when I started, I was told a lot of the ghost stories, and you didn't believe them. You thought, well, at some point in time, that's been made up to attract tourists. The one I didn't believe, but it turns out to be true, is the idea that there was an ancient Egyptian mummy found in one of the cupboards in the library. And again, this goes back to Trinity because Archbishop Marsh was a Trinity man, and the next provost who came in was his friend, a man called Huntingdon, who was a scholar of the Near East. And as they did at the time, people gave presents of Egyptian mummies. It was a big thing, and no library was complete without having an Egyptian mummy. So there'd always been a story that an Egyptian mummy was found in the library in 1888. I just didn't believe it whatsoever until the anatomy department in Trinity contacted me a few years ago and said, did you ever by any chance happen to have a mummy at any time? And essentially what had happened was they'd been renovating the old anatomy theatre, and they had found a mummy wrapped in bandages in an old wooden coffin, and they've been able to trace it back to us. And lo and behold, there is a report in the Irish Times from some poor library assistant rummaging around in a cupboard and finding a full-size Egyptian mummy in a coffin in 1888. So that was one of the ones I always thought was unlikely to be true, but it is actually true. And I went down and to the anatomy department to see the mummy a couple of years ago. I was sort of had in the back of my mind, it'd be great to bring the mummy back, kind of christen him, give him a name like Morris the mummy, and come to Marsh's and see Morris the mummy. It'd be great. But unfortunately, when I went down, it was just far too creepy, Sarah. It was just really, really upsetting. There was no way you could bring that in, let alone the ethical issues of displaying of human remains and so on. But just on a creepy level, like the thing was just so upsetting with the little fingernails sticking out of the bandages and the toenails and so on. So Morris the mummy, alas, hasn't returned to Marsh's library, but one of the ghost stories that's done the rounds, certainly at least since the mid-19th century, is the story of Grace Marsh.
Okay.
And Grace was the niece of the Archbishop. And strangely enough, there's a house for sale. I just saw it recently out in Leixlip, Marshfield House, where Grace Marsh used to live after she got married. And the story is that, and it's based on a true story, that Grace ran away from the Archbishop's palace to get married in a tavern in Castleknock in 1695. So if you can imagine the scandal even today, being the niece of an archbishop and running away to get married in a tavern, you can imagine what it was like in 1695. Anyway, so Grace ran away. She got married to Charles Proby, and the story was always that she wasn't such a wayward young girl. She'd left a letter for the archbishop, her uncle, to explain that she had to follow her heart, and but somehow the letter had got left into one of the books by accident, and the story was that the ghost of the archbishop wanders the night looking for the letter. So well, we did a quick calculations here. We sort of worked out that if he had checked 30 books a night for 6 nights of the week for 48 weeks, he should have found the blasted letter by 1828, but apparently he's still wandering around at night.
I love that you did the maths on that. That's
Yeah.
exactly the type of fact that I would latch onto and get curious about. It's fascinating. It's between Morris and the Archbishop. It's kind of, this is the closest to a sense of Halloween I've had so far. So thank you for sharing a couple of those stories. And I guess kind of, so you're very much you're talking about kind of the early days in the library. In those last couple of stories, and like when we look at Marsh's library today, aesthetically from an architectural point of view, it doesn't look like it has changed dramatically over the years. Would that be fair to say? Like, has it evolved much?
Yeah, it's really interesting because the area around it has changed a lot, Sarah. So you can imagine as the whole area has changed, the roads and a lot of the buildings in the area, which were sort of local landmarks, have gone over the centuries. But the library has sort of just remained intact, and it's remained in some ways isolated, in some ways marooned almost, because the collections were very static, and basically the librarians kept it as it was because they always liked it as it was and they didn't like change, and so very little change happened over the centuries. And internally, through a mixture of good luck and sheer inertia, and probably the librarians' real interest being scholarship and reading their own books, and not wanting to make any changes. The library internally, if anybody wants to even just Google some of the images of the library, or look at the website on marshlibrary.ie, really it hasn't changed at all internally. It is still the same physical space inside as it was 300 years ago. So that's down to the level of not just the bookshelves, not just the furniture. So we have the original reading desks in many of the bays, but it's even down to the books being in the same place on the shelves 300 years later.
Oh, what a lovely kind of reality that it goes down to that level of detail. And I would agree. I think it's you've got one of the most spectacular rooms in all of Dublin. Like it's just such a beautiful space to be within. And like you're talking about these collections, like to people who aren't entirely familiar, would you tell us a little bit about the kind of the core collections that you have within the library?
Yeah, the essentially the core collection, what really comes in early and is the heart of the matter, sort of the most important part of the collection. It consists of about 20,000 books and manuscripts, and they cover all the different subjects. So there's 4 different collections, and I'm always sort of thinking about other ways to explain this, other than talking about uh, the individual clergymen whose collections they are, because sometimes that can put people off. It belies the interest of the collections. But essentially there are 4 clergymen whose collections are in the library. They're taken in the early 18th century. They're sorted, they're put on the shelves, and they haven't moved. And each of those collections is complete within itself, because these men, and they were all men, still lived in a time when it was possible for an educated person to aspire to know a little bit about everything. So today we specialize either in the arts or the sciences, and then within the arts or the sciences we specialize in our own little fields. But really these people within their collections had the whole gamut of human knowledge across the humanities and the sciences, from astronomy to zoology, and from Aristotle to Zeus. They really had a little bit of everything. But each of them, because they were particular personalities, had particular interests and particular strengths. So, for example, Archbishop Marsh, the founder of the library, when he died, his collection of about 3,500 books came into the library. And as I say, he has all of the subjects that you'd expect an educated person to have. But he had 2 great passions in his life. One was languages,
Mm.
and the other was science. So he has an enormous collection of, strange to think, in the liberties of South Inner City Dublin, huge collection, quite an important collection of Hebrew and Yiddish books,
Okay.
which have really surprised Jewish scholars that have been working on the collections recently, coming in and thinking they had no idea that was there. And the other thing that Marsh was interested in was science. So we have a huge collection of books about the scientific revolution, Newton, Tycho Brahe, Kepler, all of those great. So each of the 4 collections has a particular emphasis. The other one that we're particularly interested in at the moment is the collection of the first librarian, who was a Huguenot refugee. So he fled France in 1686, and Marsh gave him the job as the first librarian, and his collection of books came into the library as one of the first bequests. And as you can imagine, that's really strongly characterized by French history and politics and literature.
Mm. It's interesting that the kind of the lived experience and the cultural context of the librarians and the people who are actually involved at the kind of the earlier formation periods really can be seen through the collection.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that always strikes me is that that old motto. It's sort of a cliche in workplaces. You see a little or a bumper sticker, or a fridge magnet. You don't have to be mad to work here, but it helps. Well, that really applies to librarians, and it applies to librarians certainly historically as well, because they tended to be these book lovers and book maniacs and bibliophiles. They tended to be a particular type of person. So you have to be a particular type of person to be collecting these books and trying to preserve them for the future. So, for example, Buero, who, as I say, was a Huguenot refugee, and he fled France in 1686. So he naturally, when he flees religious persecution under Louis XIV, he gets himself and his family out. which is very common. So generations of refugees have, and unfortunately still continue to have, to flee persecution, and they get themselves and their families out. What's really unusual about Buero, though, is that he was determined to get his books out as well. So he got his wife and his family out, but he got his 2,500 books out. And I can only imagine what his wife was thinking as he was packing the crates, thinking, we've got 2 weeks to get out. We have to go. You have to get, the kids were away at different places in school around France. They were staying with relatives. They had 2 weeks to get out, and Yerman is packing up his 2,500 books to get them out. So there's a particular type of individual, and there's also within their book collections you can read something about their lives and their experiences as well. So I think there's a famous phrase from Walter Benjamin saying that, you know, we collect the libraries because they tell us something about society, but actually they tell us much more about the people who collect them.
Yeah, that's and actually that leads me to a slightly mean question, but one that I'm just very curious about. I when I'm speaking to keepers of collections, I'm always fascinated in their own personal perspectives. I wonder if there's kind of one or two things in your collection that would personally resonate with you, be your, you know, not your favorite, but be pieces that you'd always incline towards.
Yeah, there's quite a bit, and sometimes it depends on the story we're telling. So, you know, one of the things we realized in the library over the last few years is that there's not just one story we're telling. The story we tell depends on the sort of audience we're dealing with, whether that's children or whether it's general members of the public coming in, and also where they're coming from in the world. You know, you'll often find people from the UK. They come into the library and they say, wow, it looks like an Oxford college, you know, or it looks like a Cambridge college, because it does. Children will also often say, oh, it looks like Harry Potter. And people have their own cultural references wherever they come from. So there's a whole range of different things that we would pick, you know, and we're dealing with the books on a day-to-day basis. And I suppose my if you were to ask me at different points in time, my favorite book or my the one I'd be taking out at particular points in time changes. But there are a couple that I always go back to. There's a very rare, very small book in Hebrew, which is published in 1697. Now, I don't read Hebrew, but why this book is to me is really, really beautiful is that I took it off the shelf. The first time I came across it, I took it down off the shelf, and there was centuries of sort of the accumulation of coal dust from the fire in the library, and then also soot and so on. And it was very cheaply bound and so on. But when I took it off the shelf and turned it round, it was an autumn morning, and the sun hit the part of the book that hadn't been exposed for 300 years, and it was clear that the book around its edges, around the edges of the pages, was bound in gold. With a design based on birds and flowers as well. So it really struck me that somebody had gone to great care and effort to take a really much like a paperback book, and then spend an enormous amount of time making this into a beautiful object of veneration. So that's one of the items that I often take out. The other one I often take out is that there's a manuscript in the library which is a manuscript of the original, so it's not a copy, it's the original court-martial records from Oliver Cromwell's army in Ireland in the 1650s. And so it is basically the records in a notebook of the clerk who is sitting there as soldiers are pulled in Dublin Castle in front of the presiding officers, in front of the military tribunal. And as you can probably guess, in Oliver Cromwell's army, there were quite a lot of death sentences for internal discipline and relatively minor matters. And it really is a fascinating insight into sort of the thinking at the time. So there's a whole range of things the page, on the pages, I think I counted there's 83 death sentences in the document, ranging from things like, somebody broke their musket when he was drunk one Friday night, sentence death, and they're all as minor as that. Somebody had stolen a pan from somebody in the vicinity of Christchurch Cathedral, sentence death, and there's a whole range of these. But it's remarkable to see these stories in the document and think this was going on in Dublin. But they'd be two of perhaps dozens or hundreds we could discuss. And I know that my colleagues in the library have other favourites as well.
I think that's so amazing, this idea that because we do keep collections like this, there is records of time gone past, and knowledge like that, those 83 deaths are something that we would never have had access to otherwise. And so it just really kind of speaks to the importance of preserving these collections. And I'm kind of curious, has the library, since Marsh and since its founding originally, has the library had a number of different stages to its life? Has there been key defining moments?
It's an interesting question. I suppose there have been periods when the library has sort of gone to sleep. And there are periods, say, for example, in the 19th century and then in the later 20th century when the library came back awake again because there were particular keepers in post and were trying to do things. So one of the stories of the library is just how dependent it is on the actions and the interests of the keeper. So in the mid 19th century, there was a real with the keeper at the time to sort of professionalize the library and reach out to readers and encourage people into the library. And really, with the collections being static, so the building is static, the collection is static. We never loaned books out. We never moved the books around on the shelves. Everything is in the same place at the same time. There were periods in which the librarians really thought, oh no, if readers are going to come in and disturb us from doing our own work, then we might just have to pretend we're not here, essentially. And there are other times when the library has been very dynamic over the centuries. So yeah, it's been characterized, and I suppose that's why it survives. It's been characterized for so long by inertia. And what that meant was that by the early 18th century, when the library was full, it was a good place to come to read and find books. But by the mid 19th century, it was at least 100 years out of date, and by 1900, it was woefully out of date. But the fact that inertia continued for a very long period meant that it is probably not unique in Europe, but it's very rare in Europe that when you come in, you're looking at a collection that hasn't changed over those 3 centuries. So the tension is about opening up something and making it available to different audiences. So making it available to kids, making it available to the general public, making it available to scholars, while also retaining some of those aspects which actually meant that it didn't change over the centuries.
And I think it's something that I get the impression is quite a high priority for yourself, very much kind of marrying these different relationships with kind of your different stakeholders, because obviously, as you said, you are engaging with scholars, but also members of the public. Like one thing that we in the little museum are huge fans of is that on your website, you have an entire section titled Play.
Yeah.
That is the most wonderful word to start any conversation. And I saw someone commented in the questions section here a moment ago, mentioning that they had attended the treasure hunt in the library. So you might talk to us about this idea of play and what that means for Marshes.
Yeah, well, over the last few years when we've tried to open up, so in 2011 when I came, we had about 7,000 visitors a year. Last year we had 30,000. So we were trying to open it up to more people. One of the things that we realized was that if you were a kid being brought to Marsh's library for a bit of culture, you probably weren't very impressed. And I remember we saw a tweet from a mother on the doorstep of Marsh's in about 2014, and she tweeted an image of a really reluctant and fed up looking kid on the doorstep, basically saying he won't come in and I can't come in. And we sort of saw that in real time, and one of us ran down to the front door, but she was gone by then. We were going to say to her, no, it's a little bit more interesting than you might think. So we really kind of thought that actually we need to think about ways of engaging people and thinking about an institution like this. So, you know, in a way, you have to start off and you have to tell the story about the archbishops and the bishops and the religious period and so on. These are the men who found the library. But we were trying to think about, are there different ways? Is there a way to tell a 9 or 10-year-old kid who, you know, doesn't understand any of those concepts, why the library is fun and why it's interesting. So really our education and outreach officer, Julie Burke, has done a great job over the past few years, but also recently since lockdown, in finding a whole way of interesting games for little kids and big kids as well, to think about engaging with some of the contents of the library. So one of the great things which has gone really well is the minifigure trail through the library. So essentially what that is there's a whole series of minifigures. I'm not allowed to call them Lego figures, so I have to call them minifigures, copyright and trademark, etc., etc. But they are minifigures, and my colleague Julie has she's actually painted and made and customized some minifigures of important people in the history of the library. So whether that's Jonathan Swift or Bram Stoker or Emily Lawless, a female novelist of the mid-19th century who left her papers to us, or Grace Marsh, who ran away to get married, as we were discussing. And that's useful for us in terms of engaging with kids. So you can come through the library and not have to know anything about the Reformation or hear anything about the Battle of the Boyne or the Treaty of Limerick. There's a whole way to engage and tell a story around the interesting figures who've been in the library, well, James Joyce as well. There's also a little mini figure of the little mummy, Morris the mummy, and that's the way into that story, and various ghosts and ghouls. So there was a discussion, to be honest, at the start. There was a discussion about, oh, is this just dumbing down? Are we just dumbing down? And actually, no, we're just telling different stories. You know, it's not that we're not telling the if you will, the more serious story, or not engaging with the scholarship in the books, but there are a range of different stories for different audiences to be told. And to be honest, I'm sure you guys find this as well in the Little Museum, that it's much harder to tell a simple story in clear, approachable English than it is to write 1,000 words of academic gobbledygook, essentially. So I found that really the hardest thing was actually writing. We have a little children's comic, and the hardest thing I've ever written is not a monograph or academic articles. It's actually the 15 to 20 words on each page to go with an illustration, which are meant to grab a kid's interest.
Yeah, sure. What is that that quote? I would have written you a short letter, but I didn't have time, so I sent you a long one instead. It's
Yeah, absolutely.
is that sentiment, but we would be very much in agreement on that in the museum, that it is this idea that, if nothing else, if the children are having fun, it kind of gives mum and dad a moment to step back and take a breath and actually perhaps dive a little bit deeper into the collection and learn a bit more, or engage with the material themselves that bit more.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I've seen a question come through here from one of the guests who are with us this evening, and please do keep typing them in as you have them. And it's not a question I thought to ask, but I'm absolutely fascinated to know the answer. Derek is wondering about any old notes that you're finding in the margins of books that have stood out to you.
Yeah, we have a project at the moment. It was something we always knew we had to do, and to be honest, we were able to use the initial period of lockdown and then coming back out of lockdown to look at a stock check. So we have a really detailed stock check going on at the moment of all the books, and in a ways that's probably I'm sort of worried now that as I talk about stock checks, the number of participants I can see there will start clicking down, 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 down. But essentially, again, as we said to the mother of the little kid, it's much more interesting than you think it would be. And we've been going through the stock check and correcting the catalogue records and realizing that there are more books there than we thought. So, for example, we thought this was a Hebrew book, but actually, when we look at it, it's actually 4 Hebrew pamphlets and a Yiddish pamphlet, and so on. So we're going through the books, and one of the things we're trying to do is we're trying to be the first rare book library in the world to have gone through completely all of the books and recorded all ownership marks in the books, all signatures and all notes and marginal annotations and drawings and doodles, and put that up on the catalogue. We have competition in a rare book library in Barcelona. They're trying to be the first to do it, but we're determined to try to be the first. And basically we're having great fun at the moment. Derek may have the question is very specific. Derek may have been following us on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, where recently we've been posting a lot of the things that we're coming across, doodles, drawings, notations from people. There are just today, actually, we found somebody who had used a book to somehow had got fingerprints all over the book. So he'd obviously put his fingers in ink and then had been practicing his fingerprints at some point in the 17th century. There's other things as well. I love, for example, when you find where it's clear that it's a school book or it's a book that was used in grammar schools or in first year of university, and you can tell that the student is really, really bored because they're doodling and they're drawing pictures of the teacher. Or there's one that I love. It's dated 1599, and I can only describe the doodle as of 2 zombie skeletons with spears. And you think that seems really, it seems and I'm just thinking back to secondary school and drawing in the books and thinking, oh, I'm so bored. That is exactly similar. Most recently, we found completely out of the blue, we didn't know that we had a particular book, and when we took it down off the shelf and catalogued it, it had been owned by the poet John Donne, who died in 1632, I think, and he's famous for that line, "No man is an island." And if there's any Donne specialists out there, they'll kind of laugh at me for repeating the one line of Donne that I know, but that's his most famous line in his poetry, "No man is an island." And it was amazing to pick the book down at random and realize, hang on, this was owned by John Donne. And a lot of the things that we've been finding in the books, they're often just notes to self, lists of books borrowed or loaned, amounts of money loaned to children, and obviously they were never getting that money back. And the best thing we found was a note from somebody saying, "Dear Mr. Buero, I'd be very grateful if you would return my copy of Aristotle from 1672. And Buero had been so naughty and so cheeky that rather than returning the book, he'd used that note as a bookmark in that book. So when we went to that book, we found the note saying, "Please return my book." And there was no way he was giving the book back. So it is kind of, in some ways it's the minutiae of the work, but in some ways it's very interesting for us. But it also means then that as we flag all of these details, people are, because of our use of social media, are sitting up and perhaps taking notice. We've had people from around the world getting contacted with us saying, "Well, I work on John Donne. I never knew about this. Is there anything else that you might have in your collections?"
But those stories are beautiful because they're evocative, and you really get a sense of these individuals, like the kid drawing the zombies. There's a very clear personality coming across there. But when you mention this whole idea of the increased use of kind of online digital technology enabling us to actually, it's making the world that little bit smaller. Like, do you do much from a scholarly perspective with researchers and scholars across the world?
Yeah, before the dreaded lockdown, we done an awful lot in terms of building up the profile of the library nationally and internationally with scholars. So we were doing a lot of graduate classes with students. Students had become very used very quickly to using online resources, but they didn't necessarily understand what the books looked like and how they were bound and how they were produced and circulated and what the difference between a big folio book was and a tiny little octava. So we've done a lot of that with different courses all across Ireland, but we were also getting a lot of international scholars coming precisely because the collections are very international. There are more books, for example, in the collections published in Lyon in France or in Amsterdam or Leiden in the Netherlands or Venice or Naples than are published in Dublin. So you would find people coming from all across the world looking for that. So yeah, we would have built it up before the lockdown to about 250 scholars a year reading in the collections, which isn't huge in terms of when you look at big institutions like the National Library or Trinity and so on. But in terms of our small collection and the specialist niche of European history, politics, culture between 1500 and 1750, which let's face it is pretty niche, then it was really good.
Yeah, it's impressive when you think about it in that context. And like, we have one person here asking, like, is it true that Bram Stoker was a past reader who would have spent time?
Yes, Stoker's great because he was that rarest of things. He was a teenager who came to the library. He was 18 and 19 when he came to the library in 1866 and 1867, and he turned up and he read on 7 different occasions. Now, to be honest, he was working in Dublin Castle at the time, and were a little bit away from the back of Dublin Castle. So I think he didn't enjoy the job he was doing too much in Dublin Castle. So I get the impression that he was on the mitch essentially from the job and would come down during the week for a bit of quiet. But he was looking at particular books and particular items, and he was very interested in a whole series of travel books about the 17th century. And he did, strangely enough, he called up quite a few items about Transylvania, Wallachia, and there is one of the books that he called up which does have a mention of Dracula in it. And it would be so tempting, absolutely so tempting to sort of say this is where he discovered Dracula. But I think the most we can say is that as a teenager, he was interested in a lot of the themes that he would explore in the literature throughout his life. So he was looking at the literature of good and evil, light against dark, conflicts between different religions and races, and he was also calling up astronomy books and books about witchcraft as well. So he was an interesting character. I'd say then, as well, actually probably now we get more 18 and 19-year-olds reading because they're related to college. But very interesting to see in the 19th century somebody like him coming along when the library really was in a bad way physically due to lack of investment, and also the area around the library had really gone down. In the early 18th century, the area around the library was quite salubrious, but by the mid 19th century, there were some serious social problems in the area.
Okay, it's amazing to think though that you still have the records and the kind of transactions of which books different individuals were taking out, because like that you're now able to look at the kind of what might have been going on in his mind and the kind of behind the scenes, and to put the kind of subsequent context onto it. It's incredible that that level of detail still exists.
Yeah, oftentimes it's it's an often it's often accidental as well, because sometimes we just happen to know what Bram Stoker was reading because a few years before there'd been a theft from the library, and a particular individual had got 12 months with hard labour, and that's a pretty serious jail time. 12 months hard labour for stealing books. And the library became really uptight for a period of time about keeping records about what people were reading when they came in. So for that period, for about 20 years, we know exactly what people were reading. The books were signed off the shelf, signed back in, and you can get down to the minutiae of what people were reading and kind of work out what Stoker was interested in. Unfortunately, though, they weren't always as well organized or as sort of diligent in keeping records. So one thing we'd love to know is exactly what James Joyce was reading in the 2 days that he came to the library in 1902. We know one of the books because one of the books appears in Ulysses. So and Joyce was a great man for recycling things. So Marsh's library appears in Stephen Hero. The novel, it appears in Ulysses, and it appears in Niggins' Wake as well. Like, once you have a good idea, sure, why would you get rid of it? Like, you might as well reuse it again and again. But in Ulysses, there's a line which says, come out of it, Stephen. Beauty is not there, nor in the stagnant bay of Marsh's library, where you read the fading prophecies of Joachim Abbas. So we know when he came that he was interested in a particular book of anti-papal prophecies from the 1570s that he certainly couldn't get in UCD, and he certainly couldn't get in the National Library. And somebody, we think it was Yeats, told him, sure, head down to Marsh's library, they're likely to have a copy of that. And he came in. But it would be great to know what else he might have been reading, but unfortunately we just don't know. So for us, it's great for the periods when the librarians were completely uptight and were really down on the readers, because it gives a great historical record.
Yeah, absolutely, because we'd love to think we can tell in hindsight which writers are going to go on to be remembered, but we can't always. But to go back to something that you mentioned there, the gentleman who got 12 months for stealing, what did he steal?
A variety of books. He didn't just steal from us. He stole from Trinity and also the RDS in Ballsbridge. So in total, it was 100 books, and he was very unfortunate. There tended to be. There's quite a few cases during the 19th century. It's something I've been looking at. There's quite a lot of theft, and surprise, surprise, the way in which you're dealt with when you commit a crime depends on your social background. So the individual who got the 12 months hard labour came from what was then a working class area of Dublin. We do know of other people who were found taking books off the premises, and there would be no suggestion that the police would ever have been called in those days. They were just told not to do it again and given a cup of tea next time they came back. So again, that's something about the social history of the library as well. Who was welcome, who wasn't, who constituted public. What sort of types of people were welcome. For example, we don't have any records of women coming to the library before the 1870s.
Wow. Okay. So perhaps the insinuation there is that they didn't necessarily have a place there up until that point.
Yeah, I don't think they would have been too welcome. There's a circular from Dublin Corporation as was in, I think it's about 1885, and they're looking at the provision of libraries in Dublin and the reading and so on. And one of the questions is the library suitable for the use of the working classes? So not the working class, but the working classes in that 19th century phrase. And the librarian's answer, and we have a copy of the answer, is most definitely not. So it wasn't that it wasn't, suitable. It's just absolutely we don't want them. We don't want them in. One of the other peculiarities of the library as well, which I often think is very funny, is that from about 1890 and you have to excuse me if this is just too minute in terms of the records of the library, if you want to kind of get me onto something broader. But in terms of the reading in the library, from about 1890, a few people begin to sign their name Irish in the visitors register. And uh, what tends to happen is that, and I assume they did this after the reader had left, they come along and in brackets afterwards they put the English form of the name. Now it's in the librarian's handwriting, so they obviously, they're obviously not having anything to do with this nonsense of people signing in Irish, and so they put in their name, and you don't really see uncorrected use of Irish names until about 1910, and then you get people in who are signing in Irish, and then it continues on. But that's kind of an interesting, I think, insight into people beginning to. There's something about a revival of Irish, and there are some people thinking, "Oh, we're not happy with this at all." We tend to think about people being happy with it, but there's another side to that.
Okay, but you're kind of seeing people expressing their identity and the kind of the pushback that is maybe coming alongside that.
Yeah. And oftentimes the job of the historian is not just to read what's written, but to think about the implications of what's written and how it's written and what's recorded and what's not recorded. Somebody once said to me, my PhD supervisor said to me, "I've sat on too many committees where people have said, let's be careful about what we minute." The idea that we rely on these historical records, but actually they're managed in certain ways. There are certain reasons why things exist in archives and other things don't. So one of the things I'd really love to know is we have some great stories about the cleaners throughout the library being kind of guardians of the library throughout the history of the library. But unfortunately, we don't know any of these women's names.
Okay, so their role is stated and its value, but not the individuals.
Yeah.
And actually, that's something that someone has asked here a moment ago. Is Marsha's library? Are you still collecting and bringing things into the collection?
Well, funny enough, I got a letter today from somebody. He didn't want me to. He hasn't given me permission to kind of mention his name, but I got a letter from somebody today who was saying that he has donated to us, and he'd handed it in to us before, but he formally donated to us today a copy of a book in Irish from 1608, which is the Book of Common Prayer in Irish. So we do still get donations. I think I saw one of the messages coming up saying, do we have to politely decline some requests? It's funny because sometimes, and it's not just in Marsha's library, we're not sniffy in any way. I don't think we try not to be sniffy, but I think all librarians, their heart sinks when somebody comes in with something wrapped up in a plastic bag and says, "I have a rare book," and often the librarian will think, "I bet it's not rare," and for us, something, we've had a lot of we've had a lot of people coming in with early 20th century books, which to us is about 200 years too late. So we do collect material still. We've had some wonderful donations over the past few years from individuals who donated individual books or small collections of books. But we have to be careful just because of the space. We're very tight for space what we collect. But about 10 years ago, we had a great donation from the Guinness family.
Oh yeah, this is the Benjamin Ivy, is it?
Yeah, when Benjamin Guinness, the third Earl of Ivy, so his official title is Benjamin Ivy, when he died, the family donated his library to us, and it remains in situ in Farmley House in the Phoenix Park. So that was obviously the family house. The house was then sold to the state, so to the official state guest rooms. So that's where Meghan and Harry stayed when they were in Ireland and so on. but the library, which has remained in situ, was donated to us. So we work with the Office of Public Works to sort of maintain and look after that collection. And my colleague Nuala Kenny in the Office of Public Works does a great job looking after that collection for us. But that's just a beautiful collection that is beyond your wildest dreams, because the collections, I've been talking about how important they are in Marsh's in the main library, and they are important, but they're important in a scholarly sort of way. So you have the scholars who want the best text, but they're not necessarily interested in having the most beautiful book, and they want to write in their books, and they want to write their marginal comments on the books and show how much more they know than the author and so on. So oftentimes the books in the historic Marsh's library are not necessarily the most beautiful books in the whole world, even if we love them and think they're important. But the books in Farmley, because Benjamin Ivy had money and he had taste and he knew what he was collecting, and he wanted to collect the most beautifully bound books, they are just some of the most stunning books you would ever hope to see in terms of bindings. Now, he was interested in the contents as well, but the thing that he was interested in was purchasing books from that moment in the late 17th and 18th century, when bookbinders in Ireland were the best in the world, and they were the most beautifully produced books. And it really is remarkable. If anyone, hopefully when things begin to get back to normal and Farmley House opens up, I really would encourage people to go to the library and look at it. It is a remarkable collection of one individual. And I think, so, to be honest, some of my kind of happiest moments over the last couple of years have been when I've been able to sneak up to the Farmley for a day or so and take some of the books down.
Okay, I did Google it, knowing that we were going to be speaking this evening, and I will probably be coming back to you, seeing if we can organise a members trip to go and visit the library once life returns to some form of normal, because it does look like beautiful, is exactly the word. But that does actually make me think to ask you about one thing I didn't realise until this week, is that you actually have a kind of a working binder, and that you do all of your own conservation in-house within Marsh's library, that you are constantly caring for your collection.
Yeah, it's important. We spend, I was trying to work it out, we spend about, you can never, you could always spend more, but we spend about 7 to 8% of our budget on conservation and repair. So we have the bindery in a separate building out the back, and it was purpose-built building funded by the Delmas Foundation in New York in the early 1990s, and we now have one member of staff there who conserves and repairs the books, and essentially uses the old techniques, takes the books apart to repair them if they've been damaged, and cleans them and repairs them and resews them and rebacks them with the leather. And it is a remarkable thing to see a book which might have been produced, say for example the one I was looking at when I knew I was coming on here. I was looking at a book yesterday from 1499, which in the technical term was in flithers a couple of years ago, and it was in terrible situation. It was really it had been badly used and mishandled over the centuries, and to be honest, it was embarrassing to take off the shelf and show how badly it was, just the bad state it was in. And after our conservator Sarah McCartan had worked on it, it's just beautiful. It's like brand new, and it's good to go for another 500 years. So it's great. Yeah, all of the original processes are used, and all natural materials, and everything that's done to the books to conserve and repair them can be undone at some point in the future if better techniques are found. So it is great to have that and not have to rely on it going out commercially and having to rely on different people to do that. But as I suppose you can appreciate, it does mean that it's a very slow and it's a very expensive process, but it's worth doing it. And once a book has got the treatment, it won't need it for another 500 years. But unfortunately, it's sort of like the painting the Golden Gate Bridge. We could have work for 10 or 20 conservators working many lifetimes, and by the time they got to the end of the 20 or so thousand historic books, they'd have to start right again from the start.
But it's an amazing contribution that you and your team currently as the keepers are giving to the next generations and to the future of hopefully the long-running Marsh's Library. And I know I read that you yourself have recently just published a book, and I go to the Cato Street Conspiracy. It's a volume of essays. You might tell us a little bit about.
Yeah, I have a copy here. It's the Cato Street Conspiracy, and it's a book about a conspiracy 200 years ago in February 1820 to assassinate the British cabinet. So I suppose I have to start off with a health warning: don't try this at home, folks. So the plot is to assassinate the British cabinet, and it was important to me it's important to me as a historian, not just to be working on the collection that I look after, but also to be doing something completely different as well. And this is completely different. This is a really serious plot to assassinate the British cabinet in 1820, in which a group of English, Scottish, and Irish tradesmen based in London, along with two black Jamaicans based in London in 1820, were within 30 minutes of setting out to assassinate the British cabinet. And it was a really serious attempt. I mean, sort of written out of the history books. And one of the things we were trying to do in the book is to explain why a really significant event like this had been written out of British history. And essentially the idea is that we're used to, in Irish history, the idea that Irish history is defined by and punctuated by episodes of revolutionary violence, and that's what makes us what we are. But British self-image is about evolution rather than revolution. It's about quiet and orderly change. So this sort of insurrectionary moment, which was modelled on 1798 and which was modelled on 1803, and which the plotters were really determined that in assassinating the British cabinet, the first person they would assassinate would be Castlereagh, and they wanted to assassinate Castlereagh because he had been involved in putting down the 1798 rebellion so brutally. So it's something that keeps me interested away from the day job, but is also, again, it's something about dealing with the history of these islands and the migration of ideas and what we know and think we know about the history of this island and our neighbouring islands, if
Okay.
that makes sense.
I know it does, absolutely, and it's kind of an interesting circle where we began the conversation talking about the librarian coming into Ireland who was working with you, or not with you, your predecessors many generations earlier, and through to narratives as this is today. And so if anyone's interested in reading that book to find out the full story.
Well, if anyone's interested in reading the book, I'd urge you not to buy it. That might sound a strange thing to do, but it's priced at £80 sterling. So please, I'd recommend don't buy it, but you could get a library to order it. And we went out of our way to make it readable and accessible to different audiences. One of the things we're also interested in is that of the conspirators, 5 of them were executed and 5 were transported to Australia. And I've actually met a couple of the descendants of those transported plotters who still have interests. Strangely enough, one of those guys, and this is completely at random and a complete tandem, I met one of the Australian guys who's a descendant of one of the Cato Street plotters, and he had spent about a decade teaching in St. Vincent's here in Dublin, in Glasnevin, about 5 minutes from where I'm sitting now. So it is a small world.
It is, and Dublin is very much a village. It's how it feels most of the time. And So Jason, you've got, just kind of, we're coming to the end of the evening, but you've got quite a number of fascinating exhibitions and educational resources that you have available online, which is, I think, presently quite useful in our lockdown dates. How can
Yeah.
we see more?
Well, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, it's it's one of those things that we just think it's really useful to try and reach out to people and try and make things as interesting and as useful as possible. So the online exhibitions, I think there's 9 up at the moment, and on our website marshlibrary.ie there's a tab for exhibitions. Uh, there are some which have gone really, really well. I think all the images are very good, and all the stories are very good. There's an exhibition up there about Bram Stoker and what he was reading when he came. There's an exhibition up there about stolen books, trying to find books that were stolen from the library and where they might have ended up, and an exhibition about books which exist in only one copy in the world, and that's in Marsh's library. So you think about it, you think about books that are printed will always survive. Well, these are just on the edge of oblivion. If anything were to happen to Marsh's library, touch wood, they wouldn't survive. So those exhibitions are all up there. They're free. We're doing kind of testing at the moment for something that I'm really excited about, which is an exhibition of rare maps. Which we're working on with the Armagh Robinson Library, 16th and 17th century maps, really, really beautiful maps. And that was funded by a cross-border fund provided by the Department for Culture, Heritage and the Gaeltacht. And it was great working and looking at the riches in our collection, but also the riches in their collection, and thinking about things we missed and that they had, and so on. So that will be coming fairly soon. We're going to make a big splash about that. So keep your eye out for that. But the tabs on the website are hopefully very easy to use, and I'd encourage people as well to think about following us on the social media platforms, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, because every day we try and post an interesting insight into the breadth and depth of the collections.
No, and yeah, I think you've a beautiful communication style, and it's I think we in the Little Museum are huge fans. But I'm excited to hear there's a new exhibit on the way, and we'll look forward to seeing more about that. I will definitely keep an eye out myself. But somehow we have come to 7 o'clock, so that's it for this evening. Jason, thank you so much for being here with
Well,
us,
thank you, Sarah.
telling us so many stories. I've had a lovely time, and I really sincerely appreciate you being here. So thank you.
Great. Okay. Thanks so much, Sarah, and thanks to everyone for listening as well.
And we'll see everyone next week for another 120 Dublin Stories with Santa Rita and Little Museum. So good night, everyone, and thank you again.